Welcome back, everyone. Today we're tackling, well, a really fundamental question, one with a lot of historical weight. Can a big, complex nation like the United States actually, last forever in its current form? History usually says, probably not. At least not without changing. We're going deep today using excerpts from Enduring Union, America's Fissures, and Future Paths. It's a source that tries to look at this structurally, not just sensationally.
Exactly. We're aiming for clarity here, not just ringing alarm bells. The
Yeah.
goal is to really unpack these four big influences the authors identify that are pulling the U.S. in different directions right now.
Yeah.
And then we'll look back at history, Rome, the Soviet Union, even our own past as a guide, but also, frankly, as a bit of a cautionary tale.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that heavy premise.
Yeah.
The source doesn't waste time pointing out empires or states that didn't last forever. You mentioned Rome,
Yeah.
centuries, sure, but it changed drastically.
Right.
Soviet Union, a huge power, just decades ago, basically just fell apart.
Hmm.
And, the U.S. itself came incredibly close to splitting during the Civil War. Seeing those examples together, it makes that idea of American exceptionalism feel, well, a bit shaky.
It really does. But what's interesting about this analysis is that the authors don't say collapse is definite. The core idea is that no, the end of the U.S. Union isn't unavoidable. There's agency, choices to be made. But, and this is the key pivot they stress, that the possibility of decay, maybe even collapse, is real. It absolutely cannot be ignored because these underlying weaknesses are being hit by multiple pressures all at once.
Okay, so let's look at those pressures, the cracks they're widening. The authors lay out four big, interconnected ones testing the Union. First one, the one that's impossible to miss, political division. The source is pretty blunt here. This isn't just the usual back and forth. It says partisanship is so intense now that finding real, lasting compromise is almost unthinkable. It feels like disagreement, more like hostility.
And what's really striking is the specific historical parallel some historians are drawing. They argue that this level of ideological division, this kind of zero-sum thinking, it actually mirrors the 1850s.
Wow, the 1850s.
Yeah, think about that. In the 1850s, the political system essentially failed because they couldn't legislate around fundamental questions of what the nation was. The source suggests we're seeing something similar now, where it's less about economics maybe and more about culture, identity, who we are, what our history means. Those are the fault lines. And when sides see each other not just as rivals, but as actual enemies of the state, well, democracy gets very difficult.
And that kind of deep division is definitely fueled by the next point, financial difficulties. The source points out that, yeah, the top-line economy might seem okay sometimes, but for the working and middle classes, it's described as a real pressure cooker.
Yes, and it's the combination of things. It's not just one problem. It's inflation eating away at what money buys, happening at the same time that automation and, globalization are making jobs feel less secure. The source talks about how those reliable middle-class career paths seem to be vanishing. And the system isn't really creating equivalent replacements fast enough.
Right, and the result of that gap, that growing inequality, the source connects it directly to fueling populist anger
Right.
on both the left and the right.
Exactly. You get this large group of people feeling economically left behind, and they lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to be looking out for them. That creates a sort of baseline instability.
And these economic issues then collide with the third big pressure point, one that's just sort of happening. Changes in demographics. America's getting older, yes, but also much more diverse. We're heading towards a majority-minority population in the coming decades.
That's a massive shift.
Huge. So what's the core challenge there, according to the source? For a political system set up over 200 years ago?
It really comes down to institutional adaptation. Can the political system, the economic structures, can they actually evolve effectively? Can they accommodate this changing population reality without making large groups feel alienated or ignored? Because if the system feels like it's stuck or only serving, say, older, less diverse groups, those political fissures we talked about just get wider. And the gridlock from Influence 1 makes it almost impossible to create policies to deal with Influence 3. It's a feedback loop.
Okay, so we've got intense partisanship fueled by economic anxiety running straight into this huge demographic transformation. And then there's the fourth pressure, which comes from outside influences. The source reminds us we're not in a vacuum. U.S. global influence, it's declining, measurably.
It is declining, yeah. And you have competitors, obviously China, India too, who are, well, pretty eager to step into that space. But the source highlights how this external stuff affects things domestically. It's not just happening over there. When American influence weakens maybe its ability to keep supply chains stable, for example, then events overseas, like sudden shortages or trade disputes, can directly cause instability and inflation right here.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about prestige.
No, not at all. And beyond that, foreign rivals can use things like disinformation, targeted investments to actually worsen the divisions we already have, the political splits, the economic anxieties.
Sure.
So the external challenges actively pour fuel on the internal fires.
That is quite a mix. A really challenging picture. The authors definitely make a case that this moment is uniquely stressful, but they also keep saying history offers lessons. It's a guide, but also a serious warning. What really struck me was the point that nations don't usually just, poof, disappear. They change. Sometimes slowly, sometimes pretty violently, but they become something else.
Precisely. And the source gives us a few historical cases to think about, connecting them to these pressures. Take the Roman Republic. It didn't just vanish in 44 BC when Caesar was killed. What happened was years of division, political violence, corruption. It eroded people's faith in the institutions, like the Senate. Eventually, the Republic couldn't function. It morphed into an empire, same geographical area, roughly, but a fundamentally different system. Its democratic soul, you could say, died. That's a warning about institutional decay.
Wait, so the democracy died, but the state continued. What specifically failed in Rome that the authors think we should watch today?
Well, they point to the failure of the elites to find common ground, and the rise of powerful individuals with personal loyalty bases. Think private armies or factions loyal to a person, not the state. When people stopped believing the Senate could solve problems, they looked for a strongman. So today, the warning is about losing faith in, say, the courts or Congress itself, and replacing that with loyalty to a single figure or party above all else.
Hmm. Then there's the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
a much more recent and total collapse. That was driven largely by economic failure, right? Just not being able to deliver basic prosperity. And alongside that, a massive loss of trust in the government. That sounds uncomfortably familiar to the economic pressures we discussed.
It does. The Soviet collapse is a stark lesson in legitimacy. When a large part of the population feels the system just isn't working for them economically and they stop believing the official story, the whole structure can become incredibly fragile, almost hollow, before it finally breaks. And then, of course, we have to look at our own history. The source uses the U.S. in the 1850s not just as history, but as a critical case study. It shows how deep ideological divides, when compromise becomes impossible, can escalate from politics into actual civil war. When governing stops, rupture is on the table.
And the last example they bring up is the 1920s and 30s. A different kind of threat, more global. That period showed how worldwide economic chaos, mixed with really intense nativism backlash against immigrants and demographic change, sound familiar? How that combination could push even established democracies to the brink, leading to authoritarianism in many places.
Right. The big takeaway from all these historical examples, according to the authors, is that nations change. Sometimes it's a slow rot leading to irrelevance. Sometimes it's sudden and total, like the USSR. And sometimes, as with Rome, they change into something that keeps the name but loses the original character, maybe becoming something darker, more authoritarian.
Okay, so the outcome isn't predetermined. Change is coming, but what kind of change? That leads us to the next part, the potential futures. The source outlines 5 conceivable paths for America.
Yeah, and these aren't predictions, more like possible scenarios based on how we handle those pressures we discussed. They range from just muddling along to complete breakdown. The first one is maybe the easiest to imagine day to day, the muddle-through situation. Basically, inertia wins. The country just keeps going, maybe makes small tweaks here and there, kicks the can down the road on the big stuff.
So never really fixing the deep problems.
Exactly. It avoids immediate collapse, but likely means chronic, low-level instability and probably a slow decline.
Okay. Then there's the more optimistic one, revival and reconnection. This scenario needs something big, maybe a major crisis that forces people together, or perhaps a truly inspiring leader who somehow bridges the divides, someone who reminds people of shared values and pulls the country back from the brink.
The third path is basically where muddle-through leads if it goes on too long. Gradual diminishment. America just slowly loses influence, becomes weaker economically, too caught up in internal fights to lead globally, and eventually just matters less on the world stage.
Then the fourth, which echoes that Roman example, Political authoritarianism.
Mm.
This is a scary one. It's not necessarily a sudden coup, but a slow erosion of democratic norms.
Right. You might still have elections, but maybe dissent gets cracked down on, the courts become politicized, the rule of law gets applied selectively. The system looks similar on the surface, but it's fundamentally changed. Power operates more through coercion than consent. Freedoms slowly decay.
And the last one, the most extreme, a second civil war. The source does say this is improbable. Unlike the 1850s, the divisions aren't as geographically neat.
True.
But they include it because, well, if political hostility gets so bad that large parts of the country refuse to accept legitimate election results or court rulings, it's not totally impossible to imagine some kind of violent rupture that formally breaks the Union.
It remains, as they put it, a conceivable, if unlikely outcome if things completely break down.
Okay, it's clear these paths aren't mutually exclusive starting points. Where we end up depends on tackling those four big influences. So for you listening, the key takeaways are really about how these challenges are woven together. That intense political division, the economic pressure on so many, the massive demographic shifts, and the pressures from a changing world order.
Yeah, the source really hammers home that these aren't separate issues you can fix one by one. They're linked. Gridlock in politics isn't just frustrating. It stops us from dealing with automation's impact or planning for an aging population. It locks in the problems. So the analysis leaves us with these starkly different possibilities, that revival and reconnection on one hand may be sparked by crisis or leadership, or on the other hand, sliding into gradual diminishment or even political authoritarianism. And that brings up a really powerful question for you to think about, building on that idea that nations change, they don't just disappear. Historically, what is the tipping point? What determines if a time of intense pressure, like now, leads to renewal? Or does it lead to decay, to becoming something unrecognizable? History, like Rome's, suggests the spirit of a nation can fade long before its borders do.
That really is the core challenge laid out in the source material. Change is coming, no doubt about it. The big question is, what kind of change will it be, and what role do we all play in shaping that? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. We hope you'll think about these historical parallels of the choices ahead. We'll see you next time.